Alone in the depths of the wild, a young bear cub finds himself surrounded by a ruthless pack of wolves, their glowing eyes locked onto him as their next meal, with nowhere to run and no one to save him. His fate seems sealed until something unbelievable happens. What force could possibly turn the tide, and how will this moment change everything? Stay with us to uncover. A story of survival, courage, and the unexpected. The storm raged through the ancient forest like an angry beast, tearing at the towering pines and shaking loose the brittle branches that had clung stubbornly to the last warmth of autumn. The wind howled, weaving through the trees like a restless spirit, and the sky, once clear and golden with the touch of early evening, had been swallowed by an endless churning grey. The air smelled of damp earth and electricity, a scent that filled the nose of the small bear cub as he pressed himself against the gnarled roots of an old, oak-trembling scout. Had never been alone before. His mother Willow had always been nearby, her powerful form a shield against the dangers of the wild, but now the storm had stolen her away. It had happened so fast. One moment, they had been foraging by the riverbank, the scent of fish and fresh water filling their lungs. The next, a deafening crack had split the air as a tree, weakened by the relentless winds, came crashing down between them. The ground had shuddered under its weight, and before Scout could scramble toward his mother, another gust of wind sent him tumbling backward. His small body rolling down the slick embankment, he had landed hard, his paws scrambling in the mud, and by the time he had steadied himself she was gone. He had called for her, his frightened cries swallowed by the roar of the storm again and again. He had lifted his voice, but no answer came. The wind carried only the sound of snapping branches. The rush of the river and the distant rumble of there under his chest heaved his breath, coming in shallow gas. He didn't know which way to go. The world felt impossibly large, stretching endlessly in every direction, filled with shadows and movement that seemed foreign and threatening. His ears perked at every sound, every rustling leaf, sending a fresh wave of fear skittering down his spine. He had never spent a night without the warmth of his mother's fur beside him, without the steady rumble of her voice telling him they were safe. The rain began as a slow drizzle, fat drops splattering against the leaves overhead, before trickling down in cold rivulets that soaked into Scout's thick fur. He shivered. He needed to move. His mother had told him once that standing still in fear could be just as dangerous as running blind. Taking a shaky breath, he placed one paw forward, then another. The ground was soft beneath him, the mud thick and clinging, but he pushed on. The forest around him had transformed under the weight of the storm. The familiar scent of pine and damp moss was overpowered by the sharp, bitter tang of overturned earth. Small rivulets of water carved fresh paths through the underbrush, and the once sturdy ferns drooped heavily beneath the downpour. Everything felt different, harsher, less welcoming. He picked his way carefully through the terrain, his steps uneven, his claws sinking into the sodden ground. He listened, hoping for a familiar sound, a sign of his mother's presence, but the forest had fallen into an eerie silence between gusts of wind, the kind of silence that made his stand on end. Then a sound, faint, almost indistinguishable beneath the rain, but distinct enough to send a spike of unease through his small frame. It was a rustling, measured and deliberate, not the erratic motion of wind through the leaves, but something else, something alive. Scout froze, his breath caught in his throat, his heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He turned his head slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. His nose twitched, but the rain had muddled the sense, making it impossible to decipher friend from foe. Another rustle closer. This time the underbrush shifted, and then just on the edge of his vision, eyes yellow gleaming even in the dim light watching him. Scout's blood ran cold. He knew those eyes. His mother had warned him about them. Wolves. A low growl rumbled through the air, barely audible over the storm, but enough to send every instinct in Scout's body screaming, run his legs tensed. His claws dug into the mud, but he didn't move, not yet. There was more than one. He could hear them now, their footfalls light, careful, circling. The pack was testing him, waiting to see if he would bolt. If he did, the chase would begin, and Scout knew he was no match for them. He was small, young. His mother could fight off a wolf, maybe even two, but alone he had no chance. The underbrush shifted again, and another set of eyes appeared. Then another. The wolves moved like shadows, their fur blending seamlessly with the darkened forest, their bodies sleek and powerful. The leader, a large male with a thick scar running down the side of his muzzle, took a step forward, his breath curling in the cold night air. Fang Scout had heard his name whispered by other creatures of the forest, a predator with no mercy, no hesitation. He was ruthless, known for leading his pack with an iron will, taking down anything that strayed into their territory, and Scout had done just that. The cub swallowed hard, his body stiff with terror, as Fang bared his teeth, lips curling into a cruel snarl. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the scene in a brief blinding white. In that instant, Scout saw. The wolves clearly saw the hunger in their eyes, the way their muscles coiled in preparation to strike the moment the darkness returned. They lunged. Scout's body moved before his mind could catch up. He turned sharply, pushing off with all the strength in his small frame. His paws slipped in the mud, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop. He could hear them behind him, their paws hitting the ground in unison, their breaths sharp and eager. The world blurred around him as he ran, his lungs burning, his heart hammering. He had no direction, no plan, only the desperate instinct to survive. A sharp pain lanced through his side as something clipped him, a wolf's teeth just missing their mark, but close enough to send him sprawling. He tumbled, rolling through the mud, and leaves his vision spinning. He barely had time to lift his head before the wolves were on him, their snarls deafening, their eyes alight with triumph. This was it, but before the first set of jaws could close around him, the forest exploded with a sound so powerful it drowned out even the storm, a roar, deep earth shaking. Furious, the wolves hesitated only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. A massive shape crashed into the clearing, moving with terrifying force. The scent of raw power of grizzly filled the air. Scout barely had time to register the dark, towering figure before it struck. The first wolf was sent flying, slamming into a tree with a yelp. The second barely had time to react before a massive paw lashed out, claws tearing through the night. The wolves scrambled back, their snarls were placed with startled whines. Scout lay frozen in the mud, breathless, trembling, staring up at the bear that had just saved his life. A bear larger than any he had ever seen, a bear whose name was spoken in hushed tones by creatures across the forest. Thunder Scout lay motionless in the mud, his small body trembling as he stared up at the massive grizzly that had appeared like a force of nature, scattering the wolves like dry leaves in the wind. Thunder stood at the center of the clearing, his hulking frame blocking out the dim glow of the storm-ridden sky. His fur, a deep earth and brown streak with silver scars, bristled with raw power. His dark eyes, almost black, held no fear, no hesitation, only the quiet confidence of something that had never known defeat. The wolves hesitated, their once mocking snarls now uncertain grows. They circled, testing the space between them and the behemoth that had disrupted their hunt. Fang, his scarred muzzle twisted into a snarl, stepped forward, unwilling to retreat so easily. Rain dripped from his fur, his breath curling in the cold night air as he held his ground. Thunder did not move. He simply stood unmoving as stone, his deep chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. He was waiting, daring them to test him. Scout had never seen a creature like him. Even his mother, strong and fierce, had not carried the same presence that Thunder did. This was a bear that had fought battles, that had walked through blood and fire and come out the other side untouched. The tension in the clearing stretched, crackling like the storm above. Fang's tail flicked, and for a moment Scout thought the wolf might call for the attack. Then with a sharp bark, Fang signaled the retreat. The wolves backed away, their growls fading into silence as they slunk into the shadows of the forest, their yellow eyes lingering on Thunder with reluctant respect. Thunder did not watch them leave. He had already dismissed them as if they were not worth his attention. Instead, he turned his gaze downward, fixing his eyes on the tiny, mud-covered cub at his feet. Scout flinched, his heart pounded against his ribs, his fur clinging to his body from the rain and the terror that still pulsed through him. Thunder said nothing. At first he simply stared, his massive head lowering slightly as he took in the trembling form of the young bear that fate had thrown into his path. Then, with a snort, he turned. Scout blinked in confusion as the grizzly began to walk away, his great paws sinking into the wet earth. With each slow, deliberate step, the storm had begun to settle, the wind easing into a restless whisper, but the rain still fell in steady sheets. Scout hesitated. He had two choices. He could stay in this clearing alone, waiting for the wolves to return, or he could follow the bear who had saved his life. His instinct screamed at him to go after Thunder, to cling to the presence of something stronger than himself, something that had just torn his enemies apart without a second thought. But would Thunder even let him? Scout swallowed hard, his paws aching as he forced himself up his body, protested. He was exhausted, shaken and drenched to the bone, but he didn't care. With one last glance at the darkness where the wolves had vanished, he took a step after the grizzly, then another and another. Thunder said nothing as Scout trailed behind him, his small form dwarfed by the giant shadow. He followed the cub, kept his distance, wary of angering the bear that had yet to acknowledge his presence. They moved through the trees, the sounds of the forest growing quieter now that the worst of the storm had passed. The path was unfamiliar, weaving through thick undergrowth and winding slopes, places Scout had never dared venture before. The further they walked, the more Scout's fear gave way to curiosity. Who was this bear? Why had he helped him? He had never heard of a grizzly interfering with a wolf hunt before his mother had told him that nature followed rules, that bears and wolves did not mix, that the world was governed by survival, and that each creature had to defend for itself. And yet here he was, following a stranger deeper into the unknown, after what felt like hours. They reached a rocky outcrop that jutted over a swollen river below. Thunder finally stopped, his head tilting slightly, as if listening to something. Only he could hear the rain had begun to slow, mist rising in tendrils from the damp earth. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet stone. Scout hesitated at the edge of the clearing, unsure if he was allowed to come closer. Thunder exhaled sharply, the sound almost amused, as if he could feel Scout's hesitation without even looking at him. "If you're going to follow me." "Cub, keep up," his voice rumbled deep and rough, like the earth itself. Scout stiffened. It was the first time Thunder had spoken, and his tone was neither gentle nor cruel. It was simply a statement of fact. Scout swallowed. I didn't know where else to go." He admitted, his voice small against the vastness of the forest around them. Thunder finally turned his head, regarding him with an unreadable expression. "That's not my problem." The words were blunt, but they didn't carry the cold dismissal Scout had expected. The grizzly studied him a moment longer, then sat on his haunches, his massive frame shifting effortlessly into a position of rest. Scout, still unsure of his place, hesitated before cautiously sitting a few paces away. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant rush of the river below. Scout glanced sideways at Thunder, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "Why did you help me?" he asked quietly. Thunder didn't answer at first. His gaze remained on the horizon, watching, deliberate. "Because I was there." Scout frowned. "That's not an answer." Thunder let out a low, growly chuckle, though there was little humor in it. "It's the only one you'll get." Scout lowered his ears, but something in Thunder's tone kept him from pressing further. He looked down at his paws, the weight of exhaustion creeping into his bones. Now that the danger had passed, he wanted to ask about his mother. Wanted to ask if Thunder had seen her, if she was safe. But he was afraid of the answer instead. He whispered, "I don't know how to find her." Thunder didn't respond immediately. The older bear shifted slightly, glancing down at the cub with something that might have been consideration. Though his expression remained unreadable. "Then you'd better learn how to survive until you do." Scout blinked, lifting his head. What Thunder exhaled, shaking water from his thick fur. "You're small, weak. If you don't want to end up as wolf food, you'll need to be stronger." He turned his gaze back toward the trees, as if the conversation no longer interested him. "You have two choices, cub. Go on your own and hope luck keeps you alive, or stay here and learn." Scout's chest tightened. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. He had no hope of surviving alone. He had no idea where to look for his mother, no idea how to defend himself if the wolves returned. If he left now, he would be dead. Before sunrise, slowly, hesitantly, he nodded, "I'll stay." Thunder gave no sign of approval, no acknowledgement that the cub's decision meant anything to him. He simply rumbled, "Then don't waste my time." Scout shivered, though, whether it was from cold or something else. He wasn't sure. He didn't know what he had just agreed to. He didn't know who Thunder truly was. But one thing was certain: his life from this moment on would never be the same. The morning light filtered through the dense canopy, cutting through the mist that clung to the damp earth like a heavy veil. Scout woke slowly, his small body curled against the base of a jagged rock. His fur still damp from the night before. His muscles ached a deep, dull pain that came from exhaustion, fear in the lingering cold of the storm. He lifted his head, groggy, his ears flicking at the distant sounds of the forest birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind. Weaving through the towering trees, it was peaceful in a way, but it did nothing to ease the knot of uncertainty tightening in his chest. He was alone, not in the physical sense. Thunder still sat a short distance away, his massive frame unmoving, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon. But Scout had never felt this kind of solitude before, even when his mother was quiet. When she left him to explore, he had always known she was close, always known that if he cried out she would come. But now he wasn't sure if she was even alive. He swallowed hard, pushing the thought away before it could crush him completely. He needed to focus on the present, on whatever this new path meant. Thunder hadn't spoken since their exchange the night before, and Scout wasn't sure if the grizzly had changed his mind, if he even intended to keep his word and teach him. Perhaps he had only said it to rid himself of the cub's questions, to let him sleep in false hope before leaving him behind. The thought sent a wave of panic through Scout, and without thinking he scrambled to his feet, his claws skidding slightly on the damp stone beneath him. Thunder didn't move. The giant bear remained exactly as he had been, breathing slow and steady, his expression unreadable. But the moment Scout took an anxious step toward him, Thunder's voice rumbled through the still morning air. "You're awake." Good Scout hesitated, unsure how to respond. Thunder still hadn't looked at him, hadn't acknowledged him. Beyond those few words, but there was no mistaking the way his ears had flicked at the cub's movement, the way his massive shoulders tensed slightly as if waiting for something. "What do I do?" Scout finally asked, his voice uncertain, small, against the weight of the world around him. He expected some kind of answer, an instruction, maybe even a test, but Thunder only let it out a low breath, and finally turned his head, his dark eyes meeting Scout's, with something that wasn't quite amusement, but wasn't entirely void of it either. "What do you think?" Scout's ears flattened. "I don't know." Thunder grunted, finally rising from his spot, his enormous form stretching upward, the morning light catching the scars that traced his side. "Then you're already failing." Scout flinched at the bluntness of it, but Thunder didn't soften his words. He simply took a few slow steps forward, his movements deliberate, his claws pressing deep into the damp earth. "Survival isn't something you're given, cub. It's something you take. If you wait for me to tell you what to do, you'll be dead before you get the answer." His head tilted slightly, his gaze still unreadable, though there was something in it, some distant flicker of interest or maybe expectation. Think, what is the first thing you need? Scout's mind spun, scrambling through the things his mother had taught him: shelter. He had found that for the night, safety. No, that was too broad food. His stomach twisted at the thought, a sharp reminder that he hadn't eaten since before the storm. He looked up at Thunder, his voice hesitant. Food. The grizzly huffed, the closest thing to approval Scout had heard from him yet. And how do you get it? Scout hesitated. Fine berries. Thunder's expression didn't change. If you want to eat like a rabbit, go ahead. But if you want to survive, you'll need more than leaves and twigs. Scout's ears twitched, and he bristled slightly at the dismissiveness in Thunder's voice. Bears eat berries, he said stubbornly. My mother does. Thunder let out a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh, though it held no humor. Your mother isn't alone. She can afford to eat what she pleases because she's strong enough to fight for it. Huey took a step closer, his towering form making Scout feel even smaller than he already was. You're a cub with nothing but fear and a name. You think that's enough to keep you alive? Scout didn't answer. He couldn't. He hated the way Thunder's words made him feel, but he couldn't deny that there was truth in them. He wasn't strong. He wasn't prepared. If Thunder had not intervened last night, he would already be dead, torn apart by the wolves, without even knowing how to fight back. His silence must have been answer enough, because Thunder turned away, his gaze shifting toward the trees. Come, he said simply, and without waiting to see if Scout obeyed, he started walking. Scout hesitated only a moment before following. His paws were still sore from the rough terrain the night before, but he ignored the discomfort and pushed forward. Keeping close behind the grizzly's massive form, they moved through the forest at a steady pace. Thunder's steps measured confident, as if he already knew every inch of the land. Scout struggled to keep up his smaller legs, forcing him to take 2 strides for every one of Thunder's, but he didn't complain. He couldn't afford to. They traveled for what felt like hours, the landscape shifting subtly as they moved deeper into unfamiliar territory. The trees grew thicker, their trunks massive, their roots snaking through the earth like veins. The air smelled of damp moss and something else, something sharp and metallic, something Scout couldn't quite place. He was just about to ask where they were going when Thunder stopped abruptly, his nose lifting slightly to the wind. His body stilled, his muscles tensed ever so slightly, and Scout, recognizing the shift in his demeanor, did the same. Silence, then the faintest rustling. Scout's ears perked, and he strained to hear beyond the natural sounds of the forest. Then suddenly he caught it, a scent, faint but unmistakable: fish. Before he could ask, Thunder moved again, leading them toward the source. The trees parted to reveal a narrow river cutting through the forest, its waters moving fast from the storm's runoff. Scout's mouth watered at the sight of it, his stomach twisting in hunger. Thunder stepped onto the riverbank, his massive paws sinking slightly into the mud, and without a word, he waded into the shallows. Scout watched in fascination as the grizzly moved with practice, ease, his dark eyes locked onto the water surface. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, Thunder struck his paw, lashing out, sending a massive fish flying onto the bank with a wet slab. Scout barely had time to register what had happened before Thunder turned his gaze on him. Your turn. Scout blinked. Startled me. Thunder huffed. Unless you plan on waiting for me to feed you. Scout hesitated. The river was fast, the water deeper than he had expected. He had seen his mother fish before, but she had made it look effortless. This looked impossible. Thunder must have seen the hesitation in his eyes, because his tone hardened. Hunger is a weakness. Weakness gets you killed. Prove you don't deserve to starve. Scout swallowed hard, his stomach twisting in both fear and determination. He took a step forward, the icy water rushing against his paws. He would do this. He had to. He wasn't going to be weak forever. The river surged against Scout's legs, the icy current, a shock to his already weary body. He dug his claws into the muddy bottom, trying to steady himself as the water threatened to push him back toward the shore. Thunder stood a few feet away, watching him with unreadable eyes, the remnants of his freshly caught fish still scattered on the rocks beside him. Scout swallowed hard, his stomach twisting with hunger. But he knew he wouldn't get to eat until he proved himself the older bear had made that painfully clear. Scout clenched his jaw, turning his attention to the water where silver flashes darted beneath the surface his mother had made fishing. Look so easy, standing still, waiting for the perfect moment, and then striking with precision. But Scout could barely keep his footing. The water pushed at him relentlessly, as if trying to sweep him away like a stray leaf. His heart pounded. He had to do this. He had to show Thunder. He wasn't just a weak cub who needed saving. He took a deep breath and mimicked what he had seen Thunder do. He lifted his paw claws extended and watched the water waiting for the right moment. A fish darted too close. He swung his paw wildly, but instead of catching his meal, he sent a spray of water flying into his own face. Thunder let out a low, unimpressed grunt that was pathetic. Scout's ears flattened. He felt a flare of frustration bubble up inside him, but he pushed it down. He had no choice but to try again. He braced himself, adjusting his stance, and focused. Another fish came into view, weaving through the current with effortless grace. This time, Scout struck more carefully, his claws barely skimming the water he missed. Again he let out a small growl of frustration. Thunder remained where he was, unmoving. "You're chasing the fish like a fool. You think they don't see you, feel you." He tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes glinting. "Stop thrashing, be still." Scout took another deep breath, planting his paws more firm. Lie into the riverbed. He forced himself to ignore the cold, to ignore the doubt gnawing at the back of his mind. He watched this time, really watched, his sharp eyes following the rhythm of the river, the way the fish moved with the current instead of fighting against it. He noticed the way their bodies twisted just before they surged forward, how they hesitated before making a sudden turn. His muscles coiled, waiting. He barely breathed. Then now his paw struck a fast, cutting cleanly through the water. He felt something solid beneath his claws, a flicker of resistance. His heart leapt as he flung the fish onto the rocks, its silver body flopping wildly. He had done it for a moment. Scout just stared at the fish, panting, water dripping from his fur. Then he turned toward Thunder, half expecting a nod of approval, some sign that he had passed whatever test this was. But the grizzly's expression remained unreadable again. Thunder rumbled. Scout hesitated, his ears twitching, but I again. Scout's stomach twisted his paws, a she, and his muscles burned from the effort of keeping himself upright in the rushing current, but he knew arguing was pointless. Thunder had no patience for complaints, and something told him that if he wanted to eat, he'd better listen. Gritting his teeth, he turned back to the river and tried again. The second time was harder. His body was tired and the cold was seeping deeper into his bones, but he forced himself to stay still, to focus. He waited when the next fish came. He struck his claws, skimmed the surface, but this time he missed completely. He growled in frustration, but before he could move, Thunder's voice cut through the sound of the river. "Too eager you moved before it did. Scout blinked, but I thought you had it. That's why you failed." Scout clenched his jaw. He hated how Thunder made everything sound so simple. It wasn't simple. It was cold. It was hard, and the fish moved so fast he could barely react in time. But still he turned back toward the water. He had to do it right. He tried again and again and again. By the time he finally caught his second fish, his body was shaking from exhaustion. He waded to the shore, his legs nearly giving out beneath him as he collapsed onto the damp earth. His fish flopped weakly beside him, and Scout let out a slow breath, the scent of it making his stomach ache even more. He had earned this meal. He expected Thunder to say something, to give some kind of approval, but the grizzly only glanced at him, then at the fish before tearing into his own. Without a word, Scout frowned slightly, then quickly snatched up his meal before Thunder could change his mind. He bit into the soft flesh, the rich taste filling his mouth. It was the best thing he had ever eaten for a long while. They ate in silence, the only sounds a distant murmur of the river and the occasional rustle of the forest. The tension of the morning had eased slightly, but Scout still felt the weight of the lessons pressing down on him. He had survived the night he had caught his own food, but the day was far from over. Thunder finished his meal first, licking the remnants of fish from his muzzle, before sitting back on his haunches, his gaze shifting toward the trees wolves will be watching now. Scout stiffened mid-bite. He swallowed hastily, his heart pounding again, the same ones. Thunder's ear twitched. Doesn't matter. Scout swallowed hard, his mind flashed back to the glowing yellow eyes in the darkness, to Fang's snarling face, to the moment he had almost died. What do we do? Thunder didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, his massive frame shifting effortlessly as he started toward the trees. Scout hesitated, glancing back at the river, the spot where they had just eaten, then scrambled to his paws and hurried after him. Where are we going? Thunder didn't slow his pace. You can fish, now you learn to fight. Scout's steps faltered slightly. Fight, his mother had never taught him that. She had always been strong enough to keep danger away, always been there to protect him, but she wasn't here anymore. And if Thunder was right, if the wolves were still watching, then he would have to be able to protect himself. He clenched his jaw, forcing his tired legs to move faster. Thunder woo through the trees, the thick underbrush parting easily for his heavy steps. Scout had to duck and squeeze through narrow gaps, struggling to keep up, but he refused to fall behind. They came to a small clearing, the earth soft with fresh moss, the space enclosed by towering trees. Thunder stopped, turning to face Scout fully. For the first time since they had left the river, his dark eyes locked onto the cubs with an intensity that made Scout's fur bristle. Attack me. Scout blinked what Thunder didn't repeat himself. He just stood there, waiting. Scout's claws flexed uncertainly. I don't know how. Thunder exhaled through his nose, then learn. Scout hesitated for only a second before lowering his body, his muscles coiling as he prepared to lunge. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but he had to try. He bared his tiny teeth and sprang forward, and in the blink of an eye, Thunder swatted him out of the air. Scout hit the ground with a dull thud, the wind knocked from his lungs before he could even process what had happened. Thunder loomed over him, his voice a low growl that was pathetic. Scout coughed, his ribs aching, but he forced himself back onto his paws, his ears flattened, his pride stinging even more than his body. He glared up at Thunder, his heart pounding. He wouldn't fail again. Scout's ribs ached as he staggered to his paws, his breathing heavy, his pride burning hotter than the sting in his side. Thunder loomed above him, an immovable force of nature, his dark eyes unreadable, his expression unchanged. The massive grizzly had barely moved, barely tried, and yet with a single effortless motion, he had knocked Scout flat onto his back. It wasn't just strength, it was control. Power wielded with precision, something that made Scout's fur bristle with frustration. He hated feeling this weak. Thunder didn't offer him time to recover. The older bear simply stepped back, planting his massive paws in the soft dirt again. He rumbled. Scout gritted his teeth. He hadn't expected this. He thought Thunder would show him how to fight, give him steps to follow, maybe even explain the things his mother had never taught him. But there were no explanations, no gentle guidance, only this trial, failure, and expectation. Thunder was waiting for him to try again. Scout narrowed his eyes. He wouldn't be knocked down so easily this time. He lowered his stance, his small claws digging into the earth for traction. He felt his muscles coil, his body tense with determination as he focused on Thunder towering frame. He had no illusions. He couldn't beat him. Not now, maybe not ever, but he could last. He could prove that he wasn't just some helpless cub, that he belonged in this fight. He launched himself forward. Thunder barely reacted. Scout's leap was clumsy, but full of intent, his small body twisting in the air, trying to strike at Thunderside, but before his paws could even make contact, Thunder shifted so fast, so effortlessly, that Scout barely registered the movement before a massive paw caught him mid-air and sent him sprawling once more. This time he rolled, he hit the ground hard, but he used the momentum, twisting his body to avoid landing on his back again. His claws scraped against the mossy earth as he forced himself upright almost immediately, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His heart pounded furiously against his ribs, his limbs ached, but he ignored it, whipping his head up to glare at Thunder. The grizzly still hadn't moved. "You're thinking too much," Thunder said, his voice deep, steady. "Thinking gets you killed." Scout's ears flattened. "I have to think I don't." Thunder moved in an instant. The older bear lunged, not a full attack, but a single deliberate swipe. It wasn't a killing blow. It wasn't even close to his full strength, but to Scout it felt like a storm crashing toward him. He barely had time to react before his instinct screed scammed at him to move. This time he did. His body twisted, his paws skidding as he narrowly dodged the strike. The wind of Thunderswing ruffled his fur, and for a brief flickering moment a rush of pride shot through him. He had avoided it. He had moved in time, but the moment of victory was too short-lived. Thunder shifted again faster than should have been possible for something so massive before Scout could fully regain his footing. Another swipe came, not aimed at him, but at the ground near him. The force of it sent dirt and debris flying into the air, and Scout instinctively flinched. His vision obscured for half a second. Half a second was all it took. Something slammed into him. Thunder's shoulder, a calculated blow that sent Scout tumbling head over paws. His wage flipping wildly before he hit the ground with a grunt. Thunder stopped. Scout lay still for a moment, panting, his limbs trembling from exertion. He wasn't hurt. Not really. But his pride was shattered. He clenched his jaw, pushing himself back up again, even though every part of him wanted to collapse. His legs wobbled, his breath came in sharp burst, but he refused to stay down. Thunder watched him, his expression unreadable. "What did you learn?" Scout forced his voice to steady. "You're too fast." Thunder exhaled sharply, a sound that might have been amusement if Scout didn't know better. "Numas, you're too slow." Scout growled under his breath, his frustration bubbling over. "That's the same thing." Thunder's dark eyes fixed on him, heavy with something Scout couldn't quite name. "It's not," the older bear said simply, "because you can change." Scout stiffened. He hadn't expected that answer. Thunder didn't explain further. Instead he turned, stepping back toward the center of the clearing, his movements slow, deliberate again. Scout gritted his teeth. His body ached. He could still feel the lingering shock of every time Thunder had knocked him down, but something inside him burned hotter than the pain, determination he wasn't done, he couldn't be done. He took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. He thought back to the river, to how he had learned to wait, to watch instead of just reacting. He had felt the rhythm of the water before he struck. He had studied the movement of the fish before committing. Could he do the same here? Thunder had said he was thinking too much, but Scout realized now it wasn't about not thinking. It was about thinking at the right time. Scout lowered himself, his muscles tensing, waiting. Thunder watched him silent. Then he moved. This time Scout didn't charge blindly. He didn't lunge without a plan. He watched his sharp eyes tracking the subtle shifts in Thunder stance. The way his weight changed, a F-ray action of a second before he attacked Thunder. Swung, Scout dodged. It wasn't a perfect dodge. Thunder still clipped him, his claws brushing against Scout's shoulder, sending a jolt of pain through him. But it wasn't a direct hit. He had moved, even just slightly, even just enough for the first time. Thunder nodded. It was the smallest movement, barely more than a tilt of his massive head, but Scout saw it approval. Not victory, not yet, but progress. Scout's breath came in fast, uneven bursts. His body ached, but that single moment of acknowledgement burned away every doubt, every hesitation. He could do this, he would do it again. Thunder exhaled, stepping back better. He studied Scout for a long moment, then finally turned, starting toward the trees once more. "That's enough for today." Scout blinked. He hadn't expected the lesson to be over. His heart still pounded his body, still buzzed with the rush of the fight, but he wasn't about to argue. He felt like he had just survived something far bigger than he had understood when it started. As he followed Thunder, his legs still unsteady, he realized something. This wasn't just learning to fight. This was becoming something new. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was changing the sun, hung low in the sky, casting long golden beams through the trees. As the shadows of the forest stretched like grasping fingers, the air was crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine filling Scout's lungs as he trudged forward, his muscles aching, but his step steady. Every part of him felt worn. His paws were sore, his ribs still ached from Thunder's blows, and his mind spun with everything he had learned. But beneath the exhaustion, something else stirred a fire, a purpose. He wasn't the same cub who had stumbled into this part of the forest, helpless and alone. He was something more now, stronger, sharper. Thunder led the way through the thick underbrush, his massive form moving effortlessly. Despite his size, he hadn't spoken since their last lesson, hadn't acknowledged Scout's progress beyond that single nod of approval. But Scout didn't need words to understand what had changed. There was no dismissal in Thunder's posture. Now no indifference in the way he moved. He had tested. Scout pushed him to the breaking point, and Scout had endured. That was all the older bear needed to see as they walked. Scout's mind drifted back to the beginning, to the night of the storm, to the wolves, to his mother. His heart clenched at the thought of her, at the image of her golden brown fur and the strength in her eyes. Was she still looking for him? Had she survived the storm? Had she given up? The last thought sent a chill down his spine. He had to find her. Thunder suddenly hauled Ed, his ears flicking forward, his massive head tilting slightly as he tasted the air. Scout stopped too, his fur bristling as a familiar scent hit his nose. Wolves, not just any wolves. Fangs packed. Scout's breath caught in his throat, and instinctively his claws flexed against the dirt. He remembered the way they had circled him that night, the gleam of their fangs, the hunger in their eyes. He had been nothing but prey to them, but he wasn't that cub anymore. Thunder exhaled, his voice low, calm. "They're waiting." Scout turned his head sharply, scanning the tree line. His pulse quickened as yellow eyes flickered between the shadows, darting between branches, shifting in the underbrush. They were watching, measuring, deciding. They won't leave. Scout murmured he could feel it. The tension in the air was thick, charged with the same kind of energy he had felt before the storm. They weren't going to slink away this time. They were here for blood. Thunder was silent for a long moment. Then finally he turned his head slightly, his dark gaze meeting Scout's. "Then we finish it." Scout swallowed hard. He knew what that meant. This wasn't just survival anymore. This wasn't about running or hiding. This was about standing ground. A growl echoed through the trees, low and menacing, followed by the rustling of underbrush, as the wolves stepped forward, first one, then another, and four more. Their sleek forms melted from the darkness, their bodies tense with anticipation, their lips curled over glistening fangs. And then, last of all, Fang emerged. The massive wolf moved with a kind of confidence that came from knowing he had never been beaten. His scarred muzzle twisted into something between a grin and a snarl, his golden eyes gleaming with a predator certainty. "I thought I smelled a lost cub," he said, his voice smooth. Mocking, his gaze flickered toward Thunder, but he didn't show fear. Only calculation and the grizzly who doesn't know when to mind his own business. Thunder didn't react. He didn't move, didn't growl, didn't show the slightest hint of aggression. He just stood there, silent, his presence alone, a warning. Fang took a step forward, his claws digging into the earth. "The last time I saw you, cub, you were running for your life." His head tilted slightly, the scar on his muzzle pulling taut as he grinned. "Will you run again?" Scout's blood burned. He could still remember the way the wolves had chased him, the way he had stumbled helpless, waiting for death. He had felt fear, so much fear, but now he felt nothing. Scout stepped forward, The movement was small, barely more than a shift in weight, but it sent a ripple through the wolf's Fang's eyes, narrowed slightly. His grin faltering for just a moment. Thunder, still unmoving, rumbled low in his throat. Not a warning, an acknowledgement. Scout's voice was steady when he spoke. "Number, I won't run." Fang studied him, his golden eyes calculating. The amusement in them faded, replaced with something harder, something more dangerous. "Then you die here," he lunged. The world exploded into motion. Scout barely had time to react before Fang was on him. The force of the wolf's charge sending them both tumbling into the dirt. Snarling Fang snapped just inches from Scout's face, but he was ready. He twisted, using the momentum of the fall to shove his hind legs against Fang's chest, kicking him off. Fang staggered back, his claws tearing into the earth as he skittered to a stop, his head snapped up, eyes blazing. But this time there was no mockery in them, just anger. The other wolves hesitated. Thunder did not. With a roar that shook the trees, the grizzly charged. He was a blur of power, his massive form crashing into the pack with unstoppable force. One wolf was sent sprawling. Another barely dodged a swipe of his claws before scrambling back, yelping, the air filled with growls, snarls, the sound of snapping jaws and heavy blows. Landing Scout didn't hesitate. He lunged at Fang, his small body moving with a speed that startled even himself. The older wolf barely had time to react before Scout slammed into him, knocking him off balance. Claws raked across fur, fangs snapped at air, and for the first time Scout was fighting, not running, not hiding, fighting Fang, twisted, trying to overpower him. But Scout remembered Thunder's lessons. He wasn't stronger, he wasn't bigger, but he was faster. He ducked beneath a snapping bite, his body weaving low before striking upward, his claws catching Fang's muzzle and tearing through the scar that had marked him for so long. Fang yelped, the wolves froze. Blood dripped onto the dirt. Fang staggered back, shaking his head, his breaths ragged, his golden eyes wild. He hadn't expected this. Scout stood his ground, his chest heaving, his own fur streak with scratches. But he didn't feel pain. He didn't feel fear. He felt powerful. Thunder had stopped fighting. He didn't need to continue. The pack was already backing away, their gazes flickering between Fang and the cub who had just wounded their leader. Scout didn't move. Fang breathed hard, his golden eyes narrowing, but something shifted in them. Not submission, not surrender, but recognition. Scout had proven himself without a word. Fang turned. He didn't run, he didn't cower, but he walked away. The wolves followed, silence fell, Thunder exhaled, watching as the last of the pack disappeared into the trees. Then, after a long moment, he turned his head slightly, glancing at Scout. This time he didn't just nod, he smiled. Scout stood there, still catching his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had won. And somewhere deep in the forest, he knew his mother was still waiting, and now finally he was ready to find her. This story is about transformation, resilience, and the courage to stand against the odds. Scout started as a frightened cub, lost and alone, but through struggle and perseverance he became stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. With Thunder's tough but necessary guidance, he learned the most valuable lesson of survival. Strength is not just about power, but about knowing when to stand your ground and when to move with wisdom. We all face challenges that seem impossible, moments where we feel small and powerless. But just like Scout, growth comes from pushing through fear, learning from failure and never backing down when it truly matters. Strength isn't given, it's earned. We hope this story has inspired you, reminded you of the power of resilience, and shown that even in the darkest times, there's always a way forward. Thank you for watching and joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful tales of survival, courage, and the unbreakable bonds that shape us. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories to life. See you in the next adventure.